Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're joining us in the world today. And welcome to another episode of the Realist Lens for researchers who keep it real. Interviews are a commonly used method in many areas and fields of social science research. They're commonly used to understand and explain phenomena from participants' perspectives. Many listeners will have had experience conducting interviews, designing interview guides, or indeed learning about interviews more widely. However, a realist interview is not quite like a standard interview you may have been exposed to before. You may be wondering what the differences are, or how you design a realist interview or a focus group. Look no further. Today, we're speaking with someone who not only has conducted many interviews herself, but has written very much in the context and is sometimes labeled as the queen of realist interviewing. And who else than Ana Manzano? Ana, how are you? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to your
Oh,
podcast.
no problem at all. I'm so excited to listen to you and to hear all about this because when I thought about this episode, you're certainly one of the first names that came in my head when I was thinking about the realist interview. And that's, of course, what we're going to be speaking about today. But for those who may be joining the podcast for the first time or who may be starting with the realist journey, would you be happy just to quickly introduce yourself, the work that you've done in the realist community thus far, and also your areas of interest?
So my name is Ana Manzano. I'm a professor of public policy evaluation at the University of Leeds in the United Kingdom. And my expertise is in theory-driven evaluation, specifically realist evaluation, but also evaluating complex interventions that have to do with normally with the intersection between the health and the social, which is one of these very complex areas.
Fascinating, Anna. And I guess that is one of the things that realist evaluation and synthesis is very well aligned to, which is that complexity, that intersection, and embracing those elements of complexity, which of course is what we're trying to do in every study that we're trying to do. But of course, not only around the topic itself and everything that goes within that is important in this conversation, but we're going to double click on the methods. Throughout time, particularly even in 1997 realistic evaluation, we already have this concepts being introduced of the teacher learner cycle and the realist interview and how you can interview different stakeholders within your program phenomena of interest to try and test these theories. So this interviews, realist interviews, often described as distinct from other qualitative approaches or just approaches or methodologies. From your experiences and everything that you've done so far, what makes this approach uniquely suited to unpacking those causal explanations? What are the differences and why is it suited for that complexity?
Okay, so this type of interview was actually invented with hypotheses and theory testing in the head. So that's the reason why they were created. So they come from a family of theory-driven interviews that firstly originated from the work of Merton and Kendall. So Robert K. Merton, who is the social theorist that some of the realist evaluators in the audience may know from his work on middle range theory. So he's the person who first invented that term. He, with Patricia Kendall, published this paper called The Focused Interview. And from this paper, then later on, the concept of focused groups was invented. So it derived from the same paper. And Merton is sometimes considered the father of focus groups, although I always like to point out that there was a mother in there, which is Patricia Kendall, who was actually probably doing all the dirty work in that couple. So they wrote about this distinct type of interviewing that had four areas. And the first one was this idea of the fact that, well, the person that was interviewed had to have some experience, what they call experiential knowledge of a social situation. So you were interviewing them because they were kind of experts in a topic. But then the second point that made this type of interviewing distinct, it was that the interviewer had previously analyzed that social situation. In our case, it could be a program that needs evaluated, and they had developed hypotheses about some of the meanings, some of the elements, some of the outcomes that are relevant to that specific social situation. And then the third aspect that was novel is that when the interviewer had to prepare the questions, what we know now as the topic guide, they had to prepare those questions in advance, taking into consideration those hypotheses. And it was only those hypotheses, so the interviewer hypotheses, that they will guide that data collection process. So, although that interview, that the fourth novel aspect is that although the interview is conducted by, with the objective of elucidate that subjective experience of the participant, what it was really important was to test the validity of those hypotheses that had been generated through this analysis of the situation, but also with the use of the social theory. But also really important that on those interviews, we're actually looking for ways in which our hypotheses are actually not validated, so we can give rise to new ones. So this kind of interview will be very familiar to any of the people that are listening today that have done realist interviews, because that's what it's all about. It's about hypothesis testing. So it comes from that family of type of interviews. And that's why it's very suitable, because that's exactly what we do in realist interviews. We prepare before we go in the field, and we have what we call some initial program theories that we normally kind of operationalize in terms of some initial context mechanisms, outcomes, configurations. It could be that they're not configured at that point, that you just have a possible context and a possible outcome, and sometimes they can be together. You can see that in this type of context, you can see this type of result, but you have no clue about mechanisms. In those initial interviews, you will start testing these initial ideas. So that's why it's really suitable for causal explanations, because it's created exactly for that.
Fantastic, Anna. Thank you so much. And such clear, like, four distinct characteristics that you mentioned there around that experiential knowledge and those experts that I guess can come from all elements of the program, right? So the people that are
Mhm.
receiving the program, the people that are implementing the program, the people that are designing the program or funding the program, and that real big spectrum that you can understand to give you ideas and all those different theories that you want to test or put into scrutiny. And I love how you mentioned as well, the number two and three about the interviewing, having that previous knowledge hypothesis program theories that you're putting into test. And I guess that's what you send at the end of testing the validity of this hypothesis and program theory. There's the phrase, right, that is used, which is, I'll show you my theory if you show me yours
Yeah,
in
yeah.
this teacher learner cycle. Would you mind just expanding on what in realist world, what we mean by that teacher learner cycle in realist interviewer? Because I guess that links to this fourth point of testing the validity of the hypothesis, if indeed they're being refined or refuted.
Yeah. The whole idea is that you don't hide what your theories are from the interview. And that's quite novel as well, because when I was writing the paper, that's why when people were saying to me about the Queen is realist interviews, is because I wrote this paper in 2016 called The Craft of Interviewing in Realist Evaluation. And the 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 key thing in there is that when we think about, when I was doing the research for that paper, and try to understand the kind of guidance that people get when you have to interview, people are normally told to hide the knowledge. Right? Pretend objectivity, pretend that you don't know. That kind of constructed naivety about not knowing anything about the topic. So the teacher learner cycle, that was the term was developed by Ray Pawson in a 1996 paper. So that's before the book Realistic Evaluation. He published this paper in the British Sociology Journal called Theorizing the Interview. And in there, he advocates for a completely different way of interviewing. It's like, if you tell them where do you get that knowledge from and what that knowledge is, they will help you to refine it. And in a way, you will get better data. So that's a hypothesis in itself, isn't it? It may happen or it may not happen, or as good realists will say, depends on the context. That will help you or not. But that's the idea, that When you're doing the interview, you may say, actually, when I was reading those four elements that I mentioned before, it says, well, the interviewer before needs to come out with some hypothesis. And how you do that, you do a lot of reading from the literature on the topic, but also on theories around the topic. Say, for example, stigma, theories around stigma. And then what you do is you will tell the participant, the person you're interviewing, listen, I was doing some reading and what this article say, or this book, you can actually mention, say, about stigma is that whatever. Have you experienced that? Right. So it's not always your own theory. You explain where your theory is coming from. So that would be the more typical way in which you will present that theory to them. As you progress with your interviews and you become more knowledgeable, and you may have multi methods that you collected. You may have done observations, focus groups, you may have done a survey, or you have a survey from another study. You can say, actually, when I was interviewing this other project manager, or when in another community or a school or hospital, they actually said that for this type of service user, what this program may be doing is whatever. Have you seen that? And obviously, you don't want a yes or a no, because that's not validated. This is really important. You want a really detailed explanation. So when they answer, they may say, well, actually, no, but blah blah blah. What we've seen, and if they say yes, you will have to then, poke them a little bit more and say, right, can you give me an example of where you have seen that or not seen that? So in that way, you kind of teach them your theory, and then you learn from their explanation. And that's where the cycle is important, because realist evaluation has been criticized for, if you see yourself as a teacher, as a researcher, that's kind of an obvious power issue there, right? Where you position yourself like in a superior level than the participant. And that's why it's really important that we're also move on from the cycle and become the learners. And you listen, and then you then react to what they're telling you while you're learning, and ask questions and poke and try to explore those different contexts, outcomes, or whatever it is that you're investigating. And you not only teach, but you also learn from that interaction.
That, Anna, that's so interesting. And particularly, as you say, that dynamic that you have constantly within that interview, that you're constantly switching roles between teaching and listening and adapting those questions depending on the answers, of course, to really get into that depth and into those areas that we're interested in. How do people usually react when you start the realist interview and you position what you just said, that it's not going to be a normal interview, it's just going to be one that we're going to be having a conversation back and forth, we're going to be testing this ideas, a little bit like a detective, they have this plan or
Mhm.
this theory of what's happened, and you're getting all these witnesses to give you evidence, right? So how do people usually react to that in comparison to a more standard interview? What has been your experience of that?
Okay, this is a really good question, because especially the new interviews, sometimes people doing the PhD, they will start doing some realist interviews, and they'll be the first time ever they've done an interview. So there are worries that are related to interviewing for the first time, and then other worries related to doing realist interviews for the first time. And sometimes they get conflicted. And the reason why I'm saying that is because you can't assume that your participant is actually comparing your form of interviewing with another one, because it may actually be the first time they've ever been interviewed. So they can't compare with any other type of interview. So that's key. My tip is, and I've always write about this, is that you explain that again. Don't hide. Share everything with your participant and say, listen, this is how this interview works, this form of interviews. I'm going to present you with some of my ideas, and I want you to help me to see whether, I'm on the right track or not. And, there's no right and wrong answers. And so feel free to contradict me if you want or not. And that seems to work quite well. My experience, and again, some of the papers that came out a few years after my paper, and obviously after Ray's paper were published, expressed concerns about using this method with some populations, right? Some context, and they say that okay, when there are quite significant power issues between the interviewer and the interviewee, people may disagree. So in a way, like social disability bias. How am I going to disagree with your research? And this came from a literature of researchers that were mainly working in low and middle income countries. And they say, in some cultures, the researcher is seen as kind of superior, or even people, if you're trying to evaluate the program, may be worried about, being totally honest, because if they withdraw the program, that's the way they live, that's the job. So the moral, so we need to understand again, like good realist will think, right? The realist interview will work better in some context than other. And we need to understand the why, and we need to learn from those whys. Why is that happening? But my experience, even when I've interviewed in that kind of population, is that people normally disagrees with the research more than agreeing. I've never had anybody that had said to me that I was right. Was my 99%, well, I would say 100% of my interviews, people will say, actually, no, that's not the case. And then they'll follow on and tell me why is the reason. And in the latest book, it's an edited book I published with Emma Williams. There's a chapter by Jo Ho on her experience of interviewing as a realist evaluator for the first time, and she explains exactly the same, how her experience has been that people normally tend to disagree more than disagree with the researcher. And I like that because there is also something about that type of assumption that that always position the researcher as kind of more clever, and that the participants are yeah, a bit like almost like a bit simple, that you can trick them, but that in general is not my experience. But if it is possible, and I totally agree with the people that have made the criticisms, if it happens in some context, it's really good to prepare for that in advance and learn exactly what's in that context that is generating that. And that could be really good data in itself about the program, if you have those issues. But we should be aware that that is a possibility. But in my experience, if people react very well, the people love to contradict each other. So it's good.
So, certainly, Anna, and I guess that should give some really good reassurance to people who are starting with the realist interviews or doing the first one, that it's a normal and expected process. That once you open the door for the person in front of you to just say what they think, and good or bad, or helpful or unhelpful, or refuting or
Yeah.
refining, that's all part of the realist process. And actually, it's as important to know when it works than when it doesn't work, or
Yeah.
when it's right or when it's not right. And that refining process, that again, being iterative, you can go back and adapt the questions and adapt those processes and conversations to ensure that it's helping you get to those answers that you need. So I guess that it gives some reassurance in that way.
Also, just don't forget that I've done many types of interviewing, and I've done, realist interview is one of them. And some participants are really difficult to interview. Doesn't matter what technique you use. You will get some people that may have the tendency to don't don't engage in a dialogue. So it's more like a yes, or very short answers, and there's nothing you can do about that. And we can see sometimes, if you follow the example of see how people are interviewed by journalists on the television, you can see how they also can sometimes, and you just have to move on and do the next one. It's not that you're doing anything wrong. It's not that you lack experience. Participants are human beings, and they are very different, and some of them will not be really good sources of data, but that's fine as well, because I think it's another really important thing about realist evaluation is that you should not rely only on your qualitative data collection. We don't Many of the hypotheses are not refined or refuted in the interviews. It could be with the literature, it could be with If you've done other methods like observations, focus groups, surveys, whatever, content analysis, it may be that you are actually refining from those things. So the many interviews that people will do will not necessarily end up with some refinement. Maybe in some of them you get zero, and others get two things that are useful. But that's good enough because then you can triangulate with your survey data or your focus groups or your observations or how this program works in another country, for example, and then you can come out with a middle range explanation that is good enough for now, and then somebody else will come and refute it later on.
Fantastic, and I love that point at the end of that our middle range theories that comes out are not the final answer in a way.
Mhm.
It's just an initial explanation, or indeed developing some explanation that was there before to help us, you know, understand this complex reality that we're all in. And that triangulation between methods, it's so important because I guess that also links to designing and adapting these interviews for your realist evaluation or for the project that you're trying to do and how they fit within that project.
Mm.
So how do how do you approach that usually, Anna? Because you say you have an evaluation to do and you want to do some interviews or a focus group with key stakeholders. How do you remain sensitive to those emerging theories or hypotheses or ideas that are coming along, whilst also being responsive to the realities that you just mentioned and the challenges of the interview? Because that, I guess, design and iterative nature of the process and of the folk and of the topic guides and everything that comes in, that is also indeed probably half the job, not only the interview itself.
Yeah. So the short answer is with difficulty. That would be the short answer. The long answer is so there are different techniques. I mean, it is going to be harder than, and I keep saying, if you've interviewed like a kind of like a standard semi structured interview, say constructivist phenomenology, whatever, is very different because you can't be more relaxed. You try and build rapport, and obviously you try and catch some of the new themes that they may be coming out of the interview, but you're not trying to configure things in your head. So it does require, and Emma Williams has a brilliant chapter about this in the book in Realist Evaluation Principles and Practice, when she talks about how is that even more difficult when you're doing online interviews, right? So your brain is the cognitive demands are superior, we think, from our experience of interviewing, following different approaches. So again, when you look at the normal standard guidance that people are given when they have to interview, people will say you have to do your topic guides, and as a maximum, you may have different topic guides for different stakeholder groups. So you may have a topic guide for the patients, topic guide from the teachers if you were doing something at schools, or I don't know, the doctors or the nurses. But how I recommend, and many others recommend you do this in realist evaluation, is that you change your topic guide after every interview. So they are individual topic guys. So the ideal situation would be that you interview. So basically, you analyze before your interview. So you have constructed some questions that are going to help you with those context mechanisms and outcomes configurations. You do that interview. You analyze it, or if you don't analyze it because you haven't got time, you at least listen to it, modify, and then modify the topic guide for the next interview in the same and the same. So that is a massive burden for anybody. Logistics come into play. Sometimes you may interview two people the same day, one in the morning, one in the afternoon, and you haven't got time to do that. But that would be the ideal. So that flexibility, technically, if you do different topic guides every time, if you think about re-interviewing the same person, that's something that is also wow. That's out of what many research studies do, unless it's a longitudinal study where you will interview people. I don't know. I did one where we're interviewing people every 6 weeks, 3 times. But in a kind of standard interview study, you don't think about going back and ask questions again after you've kind of thought about it, process it, contrast it with your other multiple methods, and then go back to them. So you've really thought about each of the topic guides every time you interview something different. But then during the interview, you have to be very alert to what they're saying, and if they is like something emerge that you never thought of, think, okay, right, did somebody else say that to me? And just, just say. And this is why it's really important. And this comes with experience to get into that dialogical approach. So it's not so much an interview, which it is, but also this is dialogue that you go, wow, oh, that's interesting because that got me thinking about this other interview that I did last month where somebody was saying that, and I wonder whether what you're saying now is related to that. So in a way, the interviewer does a lot of thought, which is good for me because I like to talk. But you do have to be a bit careful because you have to listen to them. But yeah, so you do have those moments where you have to share what you're thinking. What they saying is is making you rethink or refine and share immediately. So you have to be a bit more alert. But with time, you can do it. There's no problem. Plenty of people learn how to do it, and you'll become better. And it's all about being, I would say, prepared and relaxed.
Certainly, and I guess like anything, it's a skill, right?
Mm.
And it's a skill that takes time and a process. But what you've mentioned there around the cognitive demands of always having that theory and that process, I think that preparation that you mentioned is so important. If you've done your homework, if you have your theories really understood, and you really have that idea of the kind of information also that that particular stakeholder may be able to provide, because obviously it's not the same maybe interviewing someone who is delivering the program, or maybe a funder of the program, or someone that is receiving the program. They also may be able to give you certain information or certain areas that may be very good to answer in that way and less so in others. So that demand is really interesting. So I guess as well another potential is to give yourself some time with it interviews, right? Don't do 8 interviews in a day or
Yeah,
something, because
yeah.
that could be a long day.
You know what's interesting? Having done the other type of of interviews, the work needs to be done. You either do it at the beginning or at the end. So you either do the work of the analysis of the thinking before and during the interview. Well, with the realist, it would be before, during, and after. But what I mean is, it's actually harder if you go and do so you have your same topic guide, repeat the questions, you let people talk, you don't question what they're saying, and then you go back to your office, transcribe, and trying to make sense of that and try to come out with some CMOs. That is so hard. That is so hard. And I've had people who've said, oh, I've done 30 interviews and now found out about the realist evaluation approach and I want to analyze them as CMOs. And I'm like, ooh, wow, that's not going to happen. Because that is really hard. So if you put the work at the beginning, it makes everything easier. Well, not easier because still really hard. But you kind of set up your own pathway from the first moment instead of when go back to your office and you've got 30 interviews transcribed and try to work out some causality out of those kind of nuggets of evidence. That I think that's harder.
Yeah, so important, Anna, the before, during, and after. And I think
Mm.
that sometimes we don't give ourselves that thinking time between those process, because of course there's deadlines and there's pressures to wanting to get
Yeah.
that data, but that high quality data as you go through that is going to be so important. And I know you've mentioned your book a couple of times. Can I just give that a shout out as well,
Yeah.
please? Because I've absolutely loved it. And I
Mhm.
found it fascinating as well. Not only the chapters you've mentioned, but the one on bias was fantastic
Mhm.
as well. And the one on the challenges in lower and lower middle income countries or in different
Yeah.
languages. At the end with photo voice techniques. So it really has something for everyone. And I really do recommend it to anyone listening because it's fantastic. You mentioned as well, as we've been speaking, the focus groups. And I
Yeah.
know that that's something that when we spoke about, you were keen to mention as well, because not only we have the realist interview per se, but you've also published on realist focus groups, and and the fact that you've mentioned at the start as well around how the term got coined in the first place and everything. I think it's a good opportunity as well to just share a little bit around this sort of um this sort of data collection and method, because how do you approach realist focus groups differently? What is difference between a realist focus group or the interview or indeed a normal focus group, and what do they uniquely offer in this evaluation space?
Okay, yeah. So when I started reading about focus groups, I mean, it's always kind of annoyed me some of the standard guidance you get about focus groups. People tend to, this handbook of focus groups, where they use these terms as or like in terms of, you have to control the group, you have to get the group to build consensus on what you're saying. And having done many focus groups, it is extremely hard to do, and and it ain't gonna happen. It doesn't happen. You can pretend that you have consensus in a 1 hour focus group with 10 people. I don't know. We don't get consensus in my house, and we're actually 4 people. Could you imagine with 10? It is impossible. So, I started reading about the history, and then I found out how this group was invented as a quantitative method, really, because Merton and Kendall were trying to interview people after they've completed some sort of kind of survey. It's more complicated than that, but it was a quantitative method, and then they were interviewed with this method that I've just mentioned before, with a theory-driven method, with hypotheses, and that could be done in groups or individuals. So again, the focus group was invented to, to do theory testing, but also with this idea of the subgroup analysis. So what you can do with the focus groups is to purposely sample some categories of users that you think may be of interest to help you refine those theories. So in that way, the standard guidance for focus group is not useful for realists, because we don't want them to build consensus or theories. We want them to criticize them. We want them to destroy them. So what we need to do, and I do talk about trying to refine this idea or convert this idea of the teacher learner cycle, and talk about the classroom teachers cycle. And any of you that try to get a classroom to agree on anything, like, if you work in academia, is hard. So, how you present theories to a classroom, and how you get everybody's views into something in a way, and perceptions and experience, that it helps you to refine. And again, I don't think it's by building consensus, and that the focus group leader or evaluator, or it should help them to deliberate. So you want them to help you think. So you get that kind of idea of group thinking more than group consensus. So the group can think about the nuances, the different contexts, the different things, the different people, and that helps you to build that more complex, nuanced picture, which is what you want as a realist evaluation. You don't want a simplified consensus. You rather get a good fight in there with two people that disagree, and seeing the whys and who, and the examples that may not work at all with your theory, because that's going to be extremely helpful for you to then think another emerging theory or an emerging context that you never thought of, um, etc. Yeah, so that's how you approach them. Ready for the fight, and then don't aim to control your group. Aim them to get them to disagree with you and between themselves.
I love that, Anna. I love the embracing of critical thinking and the embracing of just, really looking at it from all different angles, because I think that's going to really bring that richness into the
Yeah.
theories and the approaches, really. Because I guess that's why we call them initial program theories, right? At the real start, these are initial hypotheses,
Mm.
and therefore, if they always were agreed and confirmed, and they're not refined at any points, then surely there's something
Exactly.
missing, right?
Yeah. That is exactly the point.
Fantastic. That's so useful. And everything that you've mentioned, Anna, has been really, really great. And at all different areas, from the interview and to the focus group, and your experiences, to really get a taster of what realist interviewing is like. I guess that if you had three tips for anyone who's listening to this today, they could be a evaluator, a researcher, a PhD student, who are in this process of realist interview, a realist focus group, from their design to doing it, or the afterwards, as we mentioned in that timeline, before, during, after. What would be your top three pieces of advice? They're going to leave the podcast, they're going to go into their day-to-day jobs or day-to-day lives. What are the top three things to really, really grasp realist interviewing and focus groups and to get better at this skill?
The first one will be prepare. Be prepared, read the literature, read other, if you can find a realist evaluation on your topic, that's the best thing that could ever happen to you. Search in Google Scholar realist evaluation of, I don't know, decision making, treatment decision making, or whatever it is, and you go, wow, they've done half of the job for me, because you can see some of the things in there. So prepare. The second one will be reach for your community, something that actually this podcast represent. And Alejandro, you told me before how many people had volunteered to help you with this with this initiative. And anybody that has any interest in realist evaluation methods will find out very quickly how we all, I mean, there will be exceptions, but people are actually very open to help and suggest and send you the reading, send you some of the Ramesses materials, sharing the topic guides, organize a chat with you online, and reach for that help of the realist community, because it's very open and it's very dynamic, and people want, because they've experienced the same as you have. They're very willing to say, actually, do that. Oh, it's okay to feel like that. I felt the same, but look, that. So reach for your community. And the third one will be just relax. It's not brain surgery. It's only an interview. If you get it wrong, that's fine. Nobody dies. You'll get it better the second time, and you will, because it could be that, yeah, you may have been a bit more shy or a bit less, relaxed, because they were the first ones, but there's always needs to be a first one. Your second one will be better, but it could have been that actually the first one was good and then the second one is going to be rubbish, because sometimes your participant is not that cooperative and there's nothing you can do about it. So that will be my three things: prepare, reach for your community, relax.
And on that note, Anna, we will end our conversation, but I'm sure it won't be the last one because I absolutely really enjoyed talking to you, hearing more around your experiences in the field and around interviews, focus groups. And for anyone listening, thank you so much for listening to another episode of The Realist Lens. I hope you found it useful. And Anna, I'm sure I'll speak to you soon. Thank you so much.